The hum was the first thing you noticed. Not a loud hum, but a low, persistent thrum that vibrated up from the linoleum floor and into the soles of your shoes. It was the sound of preservation, the electric lifeblood of the refrigeration units that lined the far wall, each one a silent, stainless steel sentinel guarding its charge. For me, Arthur Vance, that hum was the soundtrack to my solitude, the one constant in a place defined by its finality. My shift started at 10 p.m., just as the city of Cleveland was sighing its last breath of the day. Rain was streaking down the high, narrow windows of the St. Jude's Hospital Mortuary, blurring the orange glow of the streetlights into watercolor smudges. It was a good night for the job, the kind of grim, dreary weather that made the world outside feel as quiet and somber as the world within. It made the transition easier. I swapped my worn leather jacket for a set of sterile blue scrubs, the fabric cool against my skin. The routine was a ritual, a series of deliberate motions that walled off the man who paid bills and missed his daughter's calls from the technician who dealt with what came next. I checked the logbook. One arrival since the day's shift left, case number 734, John Doe, MVA motor vehicle accident, picked up from the ominous 90 pileup that had snarled traffic all evening. He was on table 3, covered by a standard-issue white sheet. The air in the main examination room was colder than the hallway, tinged with the sharp, clean scent of formaldehyde and antiseptic that always clung to the back of my throat. It was a smell I no longer registered unless I thought about it. Tonight, for some reason, I thought about it. I pulled back the sheet. The man underneath was probably in his late 40s. Salt and pepper hair, a strong jawline now slack, a scattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose. The trauma was evident but not grotesque. A deep laceration across his forehead, likely from the windshield, and the telltale bruising on his chest from a steering wheel. His skin had that waxy, pale quality that comes when the heart stops pushing life through the veins. He was, by all clinical definitions, gone. The paramedics' report, clipped to his toe tag, confirmed it: DOA dead on arrival. No pulse, no respiration, fixed and dilated pupils. The trifecta of irreversible death. My job was to process him. Photographs, fingerprints if possible, cataloging personal effects. He had none, not even a wallet, and preparing him for the eventual autopsy Dr. Evans would perform in the morning. It was methodical work, paperwork heavy, and I moved with an economy of motion honed over 6 years. I started with the photographs, the clinical flash of the camera bouncing off the stainless steel and porcelain. Frontal, profiles, distinguishing marks. There was a faded tattoo of an anchor on his left forearm. I made a note. Then I moved to the table beside him, laying out the intake forms on a clipboard. The pen scratched against the paper, the only sharp sound to break the drone of the refrigerators. Name, John Doe. Case, 734. Apparent cause of death, pending autopsy. I filled in the boxes, my mind on autopilot. The rain tapped a nervous rhythm on the window pane. It was in a moment of quiet, as I paused to think of the correct terminology for the chest contusion, that I glanced up. And he blinked. It wasn't a flutter. It wasn't a twitch of a nerve firing its last useless signal into the void. It was a slow, deliberate blink. The left eyelid lowered over the glassy, unfocused eye and then lifted again. It was a smooth, liquid motion, full of a life that had no right to be there. My pen froze. Every muscle in my body locked tight. The hum of the refrigerators suddenly seemed deafening, the rain against the glass like a drum roll. I stared, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Nothing. The man on the table was exactly as he had been, still pale, dead. "You're tired, Art." The voice in my head was rational, calm, the voice of the technician. "You've been staring at the paperwork for an hour." The fluorescent lights play tricks. It had to be. Ocular microtremors, post-mortem spasms, a phenomenon known as the Lazarus sign where reflex arcs can cause movement after brain death. I knew the science. I'd seen twitches before, fingers curling, a leg jerking. But I had never, ever seen a blink. A blink is different. A twitch is a mechanical failure. A blink is coordinated. It's a response. I tried to dismiss it. I took a deep, shaky breath, the antiseptic smell now acrid and overwhelming. I forced my eyes back to the form, but the words swam together. My hand was trembling slightly. I put the pen down, flexing my fingers. Get a grip. I was a professional. I was a man of science and procedure, not fantasy and ghost stories. But I couldn't stop myself. I looked back at him, my gaze fixed on his face, specifically his left eye. I watched. I waited. The second hand on the wall clock ticked with agonizing slowness, each click an eternity. 1 minute. 2. The body remained perfectly still, a marble effigy of a man. The waxy pallor of his skin seemed more pronounced, the laceration on his forehead a dark, silent scream. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. I felt a wave of foolishness wash over me. I was sleep-deprived. I was working a morbid job in the middle of a rainy night. My mind was manufacturing things. Of course, that was it. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and picked up my pen, ready to dismiss the entire event as a hallucination born of fatigue. But as my eyes dropped back to the clipboard, a cold dread snaked its way up my spine. The image was burned into my memory. The slow, smooth descent of the eyelid, the brief moment of darkness, the equally slow rise. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a spasm. I knew what I had seen. And in the oppressive, humming silence of the St. Jude's Hospital mortuary, alone with a man the world had declared dead, I was terrified. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days. A signature Seattle drizzle that wasn't heavy enough to be a downpour, but too persistent to ignore. It coated the window of Arthur Vance's small Queen Anne apartment in a shimmering film, blurring the city lights into a watercolor wash of neon and white. It was 4 p.m., and for Art, the day was just beginning. The hiss of the radiator was the only sound in the sparsely furnished room, a stark contrast to the silence he would soon embrace. His pre-shift ritual was a liturgy of precision. He stood before the bathroom mirror, the fluorescent light unforgiving and meticulously shaved. Every stroke was measured, every line clean. It wasn't vanity, it was control. In a life surrounded by the ultimate chaos of death, order was his sanctuary. His reflection showed a man in his late 30s, with tired lines etched around his eyes that seemed to deepen with each passing year. Eyes that had seen too much but were trained to see nothing at all. Just anatomy, procedure, and paperwork. After his shower, he dressed not in the clothes of the living, but in the sterile blue scrubs of his trade. He ironed them every afternoon, the steam and heat smoothing out any imperfections, a small, tangible victory over entropy. As the iron glided over the cotton, his mind drifted. He thought of nothing in particular, a practiced emptiness he had cultivated over a decade of working with the dead. Thinking led to feeling, and feeling was a liability in the basement of St. Jude's Hospital. His meal was as Spartan as his apartment. 2 slices of whole wheat toast with a thin layer of butter and a cup of black coffee, strong and bitter. He ate standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the rain-streaked window. Below, people rushed along the sidewalk under a constellation of umbrellas, their lives full of noise, errands, and destinations. They were heading home as he was heading to work. A city of 8 million souls, and he was an island, a custodian of their final, silent chapter. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and placed it perfectly in the dish drainer. Time to go. The drive to the hospital was a familiar route through the city's arteries. The wipers of his 10-year-old sedan swept back and forth, a metronome counting down the minutes to his shift. On the radio, a dispassionate voice delivered the evening news. A downtown protest, a city council debate on housing, and a multi-car pileup on a -5 North near the Ship Canal Bridge during the afternoon commute. Traffic was still snarled. Art listened with professional detachment. A bad accident on the interstate often meant a busy night for him. He felt a familiar, low-level tension settle in his gut. It wasn't dread, but readiness. The world above ground produced its tragedies. His job was to quietly, efficiently clean up the aftermath. He parked in the designated employee lot, a concrete expanse behind the main hospital building. The rain was colder now, a fine mist that clung to his jacket as he walked toward the rear entrance. He swiped his ID card, the lock clicking open with a sterile finality. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic. He nodded to Brenda, the overnight security guard, a woman with a kind face and a paperback novel always open on her desk. "Quiet one tonight, Art?" she asked, her voice a welcome note of warmth in the sterile hallway. "We'll see, Brenda. Heard about the mess on a -5, he replied, his tone even. "Yeah, a bad one. They've been bringing them in all afternoon. Day shift was run off their feet." She sighed, turning a page. "You take care down there. Always do." He didn't linger. The elevator ride down to the sub-basement was a descent into another world. The cheerful beige of the main hospital corridors gave way to polished concrete and harsh, humming fluorescent lights. The air grew colder, the scent of cleaning chemicals stronger. When the doors opened, he was home. The St. Jude's Mortuary was his domain, a kingdom of stainless steel, refrigerated lockers, and profound silence. He walked to the small office cubicle and reviewed the handover report left by his daytime counterpart, a man named Dave. The notes were scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic script. 3 arrivals from the -5 pileup. 2 IDS confirmed, 1 John Doe. All processed for initial storage. Paperwork is a disaster. Good luck. Art's jaw tightened slightly. Dave was prone to exaggeration, but a 3-body accident was significant. He preferred his nights to be predictable, a steady, manageable flow. Surges like this disrupted the rhythm. He checked the logbook. The 2 identified victims were in lockers 12 and 13. John Doe was in locker 14. He was listed as male, estimated age 4 to -50, severe blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed collision. No identifying documents or jewelry. He would be Art's first task of the night. Intake, photography, fingerprinting, cataloging of personal effects, or the lack thereof. The slow, methodical process that stripped away a person's final moments and reduced them to a set of data points on a form. With a deep, centering breath, Art pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves. The familiar snap against his wrists was a signal. Arthur Vance, the man who lived in Queen Anne, was gone. The mortuary technician was on duty. He walked over to the wall of refrigerated units, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast, silent room. He pulled the heavy handle on locker number 14, and the stainless steel door swung open with a soft whoosh of cold air. The body, shrouded in a white sheet on a gurney, slid out smoothly. John Doe number 734. The start of another night, another routine, another step in a process as old as death itself. He had no idea that this routine, his sanctuary of order, was about to be irrevocably broken. Time fractured. The seconds stretched into an elastic, silent scream that filled the mortuary. My breath was trapped in my lungs, a lead weight pinning me to the spot. The blink. It hadn't been a flicker, a trick of the fluorescent hum above. It was a slow, deliberate lowering and raising of an eyelid. An action. A sign of life where none should exist. My first instinct, a primal scream of denial, was to rationalize. Post-mortem spasm. Tache noire de la sclérotique. A release of residual nerve energy. I rattled off the textbook terms in my head, a desperate litany against the impossible. But I knew what those things looked like. They were twitches, involuntary and erratic. This was different. This had a cadence, a smoothness that felt intentional. My mind, the orderly fortress I had so carefully constructed, was being besieged by a single, undeniable observation. My legs, feeling like foreign objects, finally obeyed a command from my panicked brain. Move, do something. Reclaim the procedure. I stumbled back to the instrument trolley, my hand shaking as I reached for my stethoscope. The familiar cool weight of the metal felt alien in my clammy palm. This was absurd. I was checking for a pulse on a man who had been pronounced dead at the scene of a catastrophic highway collision. His body temperature already dropping, rigor mortis beginning its inexorable creep. I pressed the diaphragm against the cold, waxy skin of John Doe number 734's chest. Silence. Not just the absence of a heartbeat, but a profound, hollow emptiness. The kind of silence that only exists inside a body that has ceased to be. I slid it up to his neck, pressing against the carotid artery. Nothing. Just the dense, unyielding feel of cold flesh. My own heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the tomb-like quiet. I was alive. He was not. The evidence was irrefutable. With a shaky hand, I picked up a penlight. Forcing his eyelid open again, the one that had blinked, I shone the bright, narrow beam directly into the pupil. It remained wide, dark, and utterly unresponsive. A black void, the eye of the dead. There were no vital signs. None. The man on my table was, by every medical and biological definition, deceased. So, what had I seen? A hallucination? Was the solitude finally getting to me? The long nights, the scent of formaldehyde, the constant, quiet companionship of the dead, had it finally eroded some critical part of my sanity? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice-cold fear through me. I prided myself on my composure, my detachment. It was the bedrock of my competence. If I couldn't trust my own eyes, I was useless here. Worse, I was a liability. My gaze drifted to the phone on the wall. I could call Marcus, my supervisor. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who had seen everything. But what would I say? Marcus, sorry to wake you, but John Doe number 734 just blinked at me. No, all vitals are negative. I thought you should know. I could already hear the long, weary sigh on the other end of the line, the concerned but firm suggestion that I take a few days off, the mandatory psychological evaluation that would follow. My career, the one stable thing in my chaotic internal world, would be jeopardized over a single, impossible moment. No, I couldn't make that call. I had to find another explanation, a rational, scientific explanation that didn't involve my own impending breakdown. I retreated to the small office alcove, the computer screen casting a pale blue glow on my face. My fingers, still trembling slightly, flew across the keyboard. I started with simple searches: post-mortem ocular movement, eyelid twitching after death. The results were what I expected: discussions of nerve spasms, gas release, the kind of phenomena I had already dismissed. Too small, too random. I dug deeper, my searches growing more desperate. Catalepsy misdiagnosed as death. Lazarus syndrome. Conditions mimicking brain death. I plunged into a rabbit hole of obscure medical literature, reading case studies from decades past about individuals who had awakened in morgues or on embalming tables. These cases were vanishingly rare, almost mythological in the modern medical era. And they all had one thing in common: the deceased patient had other subtle signs of life. A faint respiratory effort, a barely perceptible pulse, some minimal brainstem response. John Doe number 734 had none of that. I had personally verified it. Every article I read, every scientific explanation I found, only served to reinforce the terrifying truth. What I had seen should not have happened. There was no box for it, no neat label. The lack of a second event was the most maddening part. I kept glancing over my shoulder, back at the stainless steel table, half expecting, half dreading to see it happen again. But the body remained perfectly still, a statue of pale flesh under the harsh lights. The silence felt heavier now, charged with a terrifying potential. My shift protocols, my carefully itemized checklist for processing a new arrival, lay forgotten on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to touch the body again, to make the first incision for the embalming fluid. Before, it was a vessel, a set of procedural steps. Now, it was the epicenter of my unraveling sanity. I was trapped, paralyzed by a choice between two equally terrifying possibilities. Either the laws of biology had been momentarily suspended in this room, or my own mind had betrayed me in the most fundamental way imaginable. The long Seattle night stretched ahead, and for the first time in my career, I was truly, utterly terrified of being alone with the dead. The clock on the wall read 3:12 a.m., an hour. A full hour had passed since my frantic search for answers on the web had yielded nothing but digital dust. I was still standing in the same spot, my body a rigid pillar of disbelief and terror. The air, usually just cold and sterile, now felt heavy, charged with an unspoken question. My gaze was locked on John Doe number 734, specifically on his face, waiting for a repeat performance that never came. The silence in the morgue was absolute, broken only by the low, incessant hum of the ventilation system and the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. This paralysis couldn't last. Mr. Abernathy, my supervisor, was a creature of habit. He'd be in at 7 a.m. sharp. The thought of him walking in to find me catatonic, the night's work undone, and a story about a blinking corpse on my lips, that was a professional death sentence. They wouldn't just fire me, they'd have me committed. Poor Art, they'd say, the job finally got to him. I had to regain control. I had to anchor myself back to reality, to the procedural, unemotional world I knew. The embalming was out of the question. I couldn't bring myself to make that first incision, not now. Not while a sliver of my mind screamed that this man might somehow be aware. It was an irrational thought, a complete departure from everything my training and experience had taught me, but it was lodged in my brain like a shard of glass. There was one task left, however. One final, procedural step before the physical work began, cataloging the personal effects. It was routine. It was tangible. It was something I could do without touching him. My feet, feeling like lead weights, finally moved. The sound of my shoes scuffing the polished concrete floor was jarringly loud. I walked over to the stainless steel counter, where the sealed evidence bag from the hospital lay. It was clear plastic, with a biohazard symbol and a label written in a nurse's hurried scrawl. John Doe number 734 personal effects. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the snap against my wrist a small, reassuringly normal sound. I carefully cut the seal on the bag and gently tipped its contents onto a clean metal tray. The items were pitifully few, a sparse collection representing the final moments of a life. First, a set of keys on a simple silver ring. A worn Honda key, its plastic head cracked, and 2 standard house keys. No novelty keychains, nothing to suggest a personality. Next, a handful of loose change, $1.35 to be exact, and a crumpled $5 bill. A cheap, disposable lighter, the kind you buy at a gas station and lose a day later. That was it. No phone, no wallet at first glance. My heart sank a little. Without a wallet, his identity might remain a mystery forever. He would be buried or cremated as John Doe number 734, his story ending right here on my table. But then I saw it, tucked into a fold of the plastic bag, almost missed. A man's wallet. It was old, black leather, softened and warped by years of use. It smelled faintly of rain and damp fabric. With a clinical slowness I didn't feel, I opened it. The pockets were eerily empty. No driver's license, no credit cards, no faded family photos tucked behind a plastic window. It was as if he had been systematically erasing himself. This wasn't just a man without an ID. This felt like a man who didn't want to be identified. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I ran my gloved thumb along the interior, feeling the worn stitching. In the main billfold section, I felt a slight stiffness, a thickness in the leather backing that wasn't quite right. It was subtle, easily missed. I probed the seam at the top, and my finger caught on a small, hidden slit in the fabric liner. My breath hitched. Carefully, I worked the object out. It wasn't a credit card. It was thicker, older. Lying on the tray under the cold, unforgiving light of the mortuary was a library card. It was an old-fashioned, laminated cardstock version, the kind I hadn't seen in at least a decade. The edges were soft and frayed from wear. The library name was printed in a faded blue font, Green Lake Public Library, Northgate Branch. It was a small, quiet branch on the other side of town, one I barely knew existed. And below the library's name, typed on an old machine with slightly uneven letters, was a name, Elias Thorne. I stared at the name, then back at the pale, still face on the table. Elias Thorne. I said it in my mind, testing the sound of it. It was a proper name, with history and weight. It wasn't a number. It wasn't a label. It was him. A profound shift occurred inside me. The amorphous, supernatural terror that had held me captive for the past hour began to recede, replaced by something else, something sharper and more focused. An intense, burning curiosity. The blink was no longer just a horrifying anomaly. It was a signal, a final, impossible message from a man named Elias Thorne, and I was the only one who had received it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was now fuel. I looked from the card to his face, a face that was no longer anonymous. The question was no longer what did I see. It was who was Elias Thorne? And what secret had he carried with him to my table? Elias Thorne. The name echoed in the silent, sterile room, a soundless bell tolling in the space between my ears. It wasn't just a name. It was an anchor, a solid point in a swirling vortex of fear and impossibility. John Doe number 734 was a designation, a cold piece of administrative data. Elias Thorne was a person. The man on the stainless steel table was no longer an anomaly. He was an enigma. The shift in perspective was seismic, shaking the very foundations of my professional detachment. My gaze drifted from the worn library card in my gloved hand to the array of instruments laid out on the adjacent tray. The scalpel, the aneurysm needle, the trocar. Tools I'd used 1,000 times with an impassive, practiced efficiency. Tonight, they looked alien, barbaric. The thought of making the first incision, of introducing the embalming fluid into the vascular system of Elias Thorne, felt wrong. It was more than hesitation. It was a profound, visceral rejection. It felt like an act of erasure. To embalm him would be to sterilize the mystery, to chemically obliterate the last faint traces of the life that had animated him, the life that had somehow left a ghost in the machine powerful enough to open an eye. I couldn't do it. It wasn't a choice, it was a certainty. My duty to the dead had been superseded by a new, more urgent duty to this specific man. Placing the library card carefully back into the evidence bag, I sealed it and set it aside with a reverence it didn't objectively deserve. My hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy. I peeled off my gloves, my mind racing far ahead of my actions. I needed information, but not the kind found in medical journals. I needed context. I walked back to the small office alcove, the hum of the computer, a welcome, familiar sound. The search history was still populated with my desperate queries from earlier. Post-mortem muscle spasm, Lazarus syndrome duration, catalepsy without heartbeat. Now my fingers typed a new, far more mundane phrase, Green Lake Public Library, Northgate Branch. The search results were instantaneous. A city library webpage, clean and institutional, popped up. There it was, a small brick building pictured under a typically overcast Seattle sky. I clicked on the Hours and Location tab. It opened at 10 a.m. My shift ended at 7 a.m. The 3-hour gap felt both like an eternity and not nearly enough time. A map appeared, tracing a blue line from a pin dropped roughly at the mortuary's location to the library. A journey of about 15 minutes without traffic. It was real, tangible, a destination. I leaned back, the worn fabric of the office chair groaning in protest. Who were you, Elias? The question was no longer a frightened whisper in my mind, but a clear, driving imperative. Did you live near the library? Did you have a favorite chair by the window overlooking the park? What kind of books did you borrow? Fiction? History? Obscure texts on forgotten philosophies? The sterile, metallic scent of the mortuary faded, replaced by the imagined, phantom smell of old paper, binding glue, and settled dust. For the first time, I looked at the man on the table and saw not a cause of death or a set of physical characteristics to be recorded, but a person with habits, preferences, a life lived in the same city I called home. This burgeoning obsession, however, had practical consequences. Dr. Miller would arrive at 8 a.m. for his morning rounds. He would expect John Doe number 734, Elias, to be fully embalmed and prepared for storage or identification. The delay would require an explanation. "Sorry, doctor," the corpse blinked at me, "and now I'm convinced he's a mystery I have to solve," was not an option. That was the fast track to a psych evaluation and a permanent vacation. I needed a lie. A plausible, boring, bureaucratic lie. My eyes scanned the room, searching for an excuse. The ventilation system? Too complex, Miller would ask specifics I couldn't invent. A chemical spill? Too messy, it would require a report. Then my gaze landed on the logbook. Simplicity was key. I picked up a pen, my hand tracing the letters with forced calm. On the line for case number 734, next to my start time, I wrote a brief note in the margin. Delayed start. Issues with the drainage pump required servicing. Began processing personal effects first. Will proceed with embalming at start of next shift. It was a flimsy excuse, but believable enough. The pumps were notoriously fickle. It was a small deception, a minor breach of protocol, but it felt like I was stepping off a cliff. I had officially prioritized my own strange quest over my professional duties. I was actively concealing my actions, creating a cover story to facilitate a private investigation into a man who was, by all medical and legal definitions, dead. The Art Vance who had clocked in hours ago, the man who prided himself on order and precision, was gone. In his place was someone else, someone driven by a compulsion he didn't understand, heading into uncharted territory. The final hours of my shift crawled by. I did my other tasks, cleaning instruments, updating paperwork, preparing for the next arrival, but it was all mechanical. My mind was elsewhere with Elias. Every so often, I would glance back at the gurney, half expecting to see him watching me, a silent conspirator in my burgeoning deception. But he remained still, his face placid, a mask of neutrality. The secret of the blink was ours alone. As the first sliver of watery gray light pierced the high, frosted window of the prep room, it signaled the end of my shift and the beginning of something else entirely. The dawn didn't bring relief, it brought anticipation. I felt a tremor of nervous energy, the kind you get before a long journey. I changed out of my scrubs, the fabric sticking to my skin. Before leaving, I stood by the door and looked back one last time at the still form of Elias Thorne. I didn't say it out loud, but a silent promise formed in my mind, a vow made to a dead man in the quiet of a Seattle morgue. I'll find out who you were. The clock on the wall, a mercilessly objective observer, clicked over to 7 a.m. The sound, usually a welcome signal of release, was a starting pistol for a race I hadn't trained for. My shift was over. I signed the logbook, my hand steady despite the tremor in my soul. My signature sat beside the lie I'd written about the refrigeration unit malfunction, a black mark on my otherwise pristine record. Each letter felt like a betrayal of the man I was yesterday. Stepping out of the sterile, climate-controlled mortuary into the Seattle morning was a physical shock. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of rain-washed pavement and brewing coffee from a cafe down the street. It was the smell of life, and it felt alien. A gray, bruised-looking sky hung low over the city, the clouds weeping a fine mist that settled on my skin like a cold sweat. After a night spent in the silent company of the dead, the rumble of early traffic and the distant cry of a ferry horn were an overwhelming cacophony. My car, parked in its usual spot, felt like a foreign vessel. I sat behind the wheel for a full minute, the keys slick in my palm. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger. Hollowed eyes sunk into dark sockets, skin pale and clammy. I looked haunted. I felt haunted. The image of Elias Thorne's eye, the slow, deliberate blink, was burned onto the back of my retinas. Driving felt automatic, my body performing the familiar motions while my mind raced. The streets of Belltown, normally just a grid to navigate, seemed charged with meaning. Every person I saw on the sidewalk, a woman jogging with her dog, a man in a suit rushing with a briefcase, a barista wiping down an outdoor table, was a universe of secrets and stories just like the man on my steel table. I was an outsider, a ghost in the machine of the living, separated from them by the impossible thing I had seen. The Green Lake Public Library was exactly what I'd pictured. A handsome, two-story brick building from another era, nestled amongst the towering trees that gave the neighborhood its name. It looked solid, permanent, a sanctuary. I found a parking spot and killed the engine, the silence rushing back in. In my pocket, my fingers found the smooth, worn edges of the library card. Elia's Thorn. The name was a mantra, a prayer, the only thing keeping me anchored. I had to know. Inside, the library smelled of old paper, binding glue, and floor polish. It was warm and quiet, the only sounds the soft rustle of turning pages and the gentle hum of the lights. A few early patrons were scattered amongst the shelves, lost in their own worlds. For a moment, the peace of the place almost calmed the frantic buzzing in my head. Almost. I approached the main circulation desk, a long, polished oak counter that commanded the room. Behind it, a woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun was meticulously stamping a stack of books. She wore half-moon glasses perched on the end of her nose and looked up as I approached, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and professional. Her name tag read Linda. "Morning," I managed, my own voice raspy from disuse. I cleared my throat. "I was hoping you could help me. I'm trying to find someone." I slid the library card onto the counter. Linda picked it up, her expression unreadable. She turned it over in her fingers, a flicker of something, nostalgia, perhaps, in her eyes as she saw the old paper and faded ink. "This is an old one," she stated, not unkindly. "We haven't used this system in, at least 15 years. Where did you find it?" My prepared lie felt clumsy on my tongue. "It belonged to my uncle, Elia's Thorn. We were estranged. He passed away recently, and I'm handling his affairs. I'm just trying to piece things together." The words tasted like ash. I was using his death, the very thing I was investigating, as a tool. Linda's professional demeanor softened slightly with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. She tried to scan the card's barcode, but the scanner emitted a flat, negative beep. "As I said, this format is obsolete. The membership number isn't in our current digital system." My heart sank. A dead end. Of course, it was a dead end. "So there's nothing you can do? No records at all?" "I'm afraid not," she said, and then she paused, a look of consideration on her face. "And even if I could, library policy is very strict about patron privacy. I couldn't give you an address or contact information." This was it, the wall I knew I would hit. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. The exhaustion of the long night, the terror, the desperate hope, it all crashed down at once. I must have looked as broken as I felt, because Linda's gaze lingered on me. "Elia's Thorn," she repeated softly, tapping the name on the card with her finger. "It sounds familiar." Hope, sharp and painful, shot through me. "You knew him?" "I don't know about knew," she mused, peering over her glasses at a point on the far wall as she searched her memory. "It's a distinctive name. He was a regular for a while, a very quiet man, always sat in the same chair, over by the window in the poetry section." She looked back at me, her curiosity now clearly piqued. "He was particular. He never checked out anything new or popular. In fact, for months, he only ever checked out one book, over and over again." My breath caught in my chest. This was more than an address. This was a piece of him. "Which book?" Linda's brow furrowed in concentration. "Something local, obscure, not one of our more popular items." She turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't looking up a name, but a keyword. A moment later, she nodded to herself. "That's it. Echoes of the Sound," by a poet named Alastair Finch. "We only have one copy." She gave me a knowing look, one that went beyond professional courtesy. It was a look of human connection, of someone choosing to bend a rule not written in any policy book. "It's in section 811.54 on the second floor. Our copy is well loved, especially by your uncle." "Thank you," I said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "Thank you, Linda." I walked away from the desk, my legs moving with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just chasing a ghost anymore. I was following a trail. As I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the weight of my exhaustion was still there. But now it was buoyed by something new. A tangible, literary clue to the life of the man who had opened his eyes. The weight of Linda's words, echoes of the sound, settled in the quiet library air, a tangible thing. It was more than a title, it was a destination. Art gave the librarian a nod of thanks that felt entirely inadequate for the key she had just handed him. He moved away from the desk, his exhausted body operating on a fuel source that wasn't caffeine or adrenaline, but pure, unyielding obsession. He found the local authors section tucked away in a corner, bathed in the soft, gray light filtering through a large window overlooking the lake. The shelves were filled with slim volumes, personal histories, and civic pride bound in paper. He ran his finger along the spines, the titles a quiet murmur of Seattle's soul. Rain City Rhapsodies, Under the Needle's Shadow, The Fisherman's Lament. And then he saw it. Echoes of the Sound. The book was thin, its cover a faded photograph of Puget Sound at dusk, the water a melancholy blue-gray. It was worn, the corners soft, the spine creased. It had been loved, or at least frequently held. As Art pulled it from the shelf, a faint, dry scent of old paper and dust filled his nostrils. It felt less like a book and more like a relic. He carried it to an empty carrel, the wood cool and solid beneath his forearms. For a moment, he just stared at it. This was Elias Thorne's refuge, the place he returned to again and again. With a hand that trembled slightly, Art opened the cover. The checkout card sleeve inside was thick with stamped dates, a testament to its long life in the library system. He didn't need to look for Elias' signature. He knew it would be lost in a sea of others. He began to turn the pages, his heart thudding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The poems were simple, stark depictions of life in the Pacific Northwest. Ferries cutting through mist, the lonely cry of gulls, the relentless drizzle that seeped into the bones. He was halfway through the book, a knot of disappointment tightening in his gut when he found it. It wasn't a note or a highlighted passage. It was a single poem, enclosed in a faint, almost hesitant circle drawn in pencil. The pressure of the graphite was uneven, deeper in some parts of the curve than others, as if the hand that drew it had paused, deliberating. The poem was titled The Harbor. Art leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat as he read. Do not stand beside the quiet shore and watch the empty vessel I became. The hull is breached, the sails are torn, it only ever answered to my name. That ship has served its journey on the tide, and what it carried has been safely flown. The final cargo was the piece inside, the rest is timber, meant to be alone. Look not for me in stillness, cold and deep, but in the echo of a story told. My voyage ends, a promise I will keep, let the empty harbor now grow old. The words hit Art with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. It wasn't a clue. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a goodbye, a release. A man who had not only accepted his mortality, but had embraced it as a natural, peaceful transition. Elias Thorne wasn't trapped. He wasn't trying to communicate from some horrifying state of limbo. He was gone. He had made his peace long before his car ever met that guardrail. And in that stunning moment of clarity, the entire, terrifying illusion shattered. The blink. It hadn't been Elias, it had been Art. An image flooded his mind, unbidden and sharp. The funeral home 10 years prior. His father, lying in a casket, looking smaller and strangely artificial under the mortician's handiwork. Art had stood there, dry-eyed and numb, his mind dissecting the process. He noted the suturing on his father's mouth, the waxy texture of the skin, the subtle application of cosmetics. He'd treated it like a case study, a professional assessment. He hadn't cried. He hadn't grieved. He had walled off the pain with procedure, with the cold, hard facts of anatomy and chemistry. He had turned his father into just another body. John Doe number 734, a man with no name and no story, had become the blank canvas for a decade of Art's repressed grief. The exhaustion, the isolation of his job, the profound loneliness of his life. It had all coalesced into a single, desperate need for connection, for meaning in the face of oblivion. His subconscious had manufactured a miracle, a sign, a ghost in the machine, because the alternative, that death was simply an end, and that he had failed to honor his own father's passing, was too painful to confront. Elias Thorne, the quiet man who loved poetry, had given him the answer. He hadn't been asking for help, he had been offering a lesson in acceptance. Art closed the book, his hands no longer trembling. A profound, aching sadness washed over him, but it was clean. It wasn't the jagged edge of fear. It was the deep, quiet sorrow of release. He carefully slid echoes of the sound back into its place on the shelf, a silent thank you to the man he would never know. Driving back to the mortuary, Seattle looked different. The gray sky wasn't oppressive, it was soft. The steady rhythm of the windshield wipers wasn't maddening, it was meditative. When he walked back into the prep room, the silence didn't feel menacing anymore. It was peaceful. It was respectful. He stood before the gurney. John Doe number 734 was gone. In his place lay Elias Thorne. Art looked at his face, at the closed eyes, and felt no fear. He saw a man who had lived, who had found solace in poetry, who had prepared himself for this final journey. His work was not to solve a mystery, but to fulfill a duty, to offer this man the final dignity he deserved, the dignity Art had denied his own father. He opened the logbook and drew a neat line through the falsified entry. With a steady hand, he wrote the correct time and date, signing his name beside it. Then, he turned to Elias. He picked up his instruments, the familiar weight of them now comforting in his grasp. The work began, not as a cold, mechanical process, but as a quiet, focused ritual of care. The hum of the aspirator, the gentle click of tools on the stainless steel tray, they were no longer sounds to be endured, but the cadence of a final, respectful service. He had faced the ghost and found it was his own.